Well, thanks very much. Really happy to be here today. I want to recognize that I'm on the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples.
Wait, stop. What did she just say?
I want to recognize that I'm on the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples.
That's exactly what I thought. She said that because of UNDRIP.
COVID-19 has certainly reshaped so many aspects of our lives, including how we get around in our communities and how we connect with each other. As a government, our focus has never wavered from the health and safety of Canadians and on getting safely through this pandemic. But we will get through it, but we will still have the climate crisis to deal with. And as we make investments that are critical to restarting our economy and creating 1 million jobs, we need to look at ways to build back better.
Okay, yeah, build back better. You'll recognize that from the Great Reset.
To building the Canada we want, with good jobs, a sustainable economy, cleaner air, and more inclusive communities where people want to live, work, and raise their families. We've been very focused on how do we support communities from coast to coast to coast. Just last week, the finance minister and myself announced that we doubled support to cities and towns and Indigenous communities by providing $2.2 billion for infrastructure. That will mean more money in communities to support public transit, broadband, community culture and recreation centers, getting Canadians to work in these communities, and restarting our economy. Last month, I announced with the Prime Minister nearly $15 billion in new funding for public transit infrastructure projects over the next 8 years.
Notice how McKenna gave an 8-year-long time frame? In 8 years, it'll be the year 2030. It's a deadline set out by the UN and the 17th Sustainable Development Goals for Agenda 2030. Public transit in rural areas in 8 years? Imagine how much that will cost.
As well as Canada's first ever $3 billion per year permanent public transit fund. We're already committed to investing in public transit, and that's what we're doing. So this is building on what has already worked, the $28.5 billion that we're investing in public transit projects through our government. As part of that funding, we announced $2.75 billion in investments in zero-emission buses, also leveraging the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which will be investing $1.5 billion as part of its $5 billion commitment to public transit. We announced $400 million for active transit solutions, which is Canada's first ever active transit fund, which will fund cycling and walking paths across the country.
Okay, there's nothing wrong with funding for infrastructure. Students, need to take transit to get to university. People who live, in downtown regions and whatnot. But public transit should be just that, an option, and not something you're forced to take.
Infrastructure is critically important. It's really about building the future that we need and the future we want. When we look at transportation, it is critically important to support our communities and to support people in those communities. And that's especially true for people living in rural, remote parts of Canada. And that's why we're here today. Canadians living in rural, remote communities and small towns, as well as Indigenous communities across the country, face unique challenges in accessing transportation options to help them get to work and school, access shops and services, and just get around. We've heard loud and clear from rural, remote, and small communities that they need specific funding to support their unique transportation needs. They need flexible solutions tailored to their community needs, their economies, and their geography. From on-demand busing services to volunteer community carpooling, rural Canadians have been finding unique ways to get around. That's why we're investing $250 million in our first ever rural transit fund. We'll be working with communities to help them find the best transit solutions and provide them with support to make them a reality for more people. This is in addition to existing funding that's supporting transit projects in smaller communities like bus service in Selkirk, Manitoba, to a handy van in Fort Frances, Ontario. This will support job creation and economic growth in these communities. It'll help tackle the climate crisis.
And the truth comes out. Establishing public transit in rural areas and small towns may sound like a good idea at first, but remember, in the future, Canada's technocrats for sustainable development want cars to be somewhat phased out entirely. So if you thought you'd simply move from the city to an acreage and escape the globalist madness and keep your car, they've already considered that. They got a plan for you.
And it will help build more inclusive communities across the country. This funding is about creating equity amongst communities across the country and making sure that vulnerable citizens, often the elderly, those living with a disability, and low-income Canadians have the means to get where they need to go, no matter where they live. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Il n'existe pas de solution universelle. Canada's first flexible, dedicated rural transit fund will support innovative and creative projects that help address the needs and gaps in these communities. Building big things in Canada has always been about nation building. We built big because we thought big. Now in 2021, it's time to think big and build again. Canada's first dedicated fund for rural transit solutions can help us create jobs right now, as well as growth, tackle climate change and build more resilient communities, and make communities more inclusive for all. As I've said before, every taxpayer dollar that we invest must do triple duty. It needs to create jobs at a time when we need it, as well as economic growth. It needs to tackle climate change and make communities more resilient. And we need to create communities that are more equitable so that every Canadian has a chance to succeed. And with that, I'd like to hand the virtual mic over to my colleague, Minister Monta.
So there you have it, folks. The Trudeau Liberals have an Agenda 2030 based plan for every single Canadian. Even have a plan to put residents of small towns and villages on public transit. This might even be applicable for farmers with enough time, perhaps decades, who knows. Although it's entirely possible we get the details wrong along the way or misunderstand what's going on, we now have a basic understanding of how they might plan to phase out cars for rural areas. Only time will tell as Canadians march forward to the year 2030.